Well, good evening, everybody, and welcome to this online talk presented to you by Beacon Northern Footpath Society. I'm David Gosling, and I'm very pleased to welcome tonight Simon Thompson. Simon is one of our footpath inspectors, but tonight he's going to be talking about his PhD thesis, which is entitled The Hiking Craze. Now, I've read this thesis and I thought it was wonderful. It explains how we had an enormous expansion of walking as a recreational activity in the 1920s and 30s. And that history is still very relevant for today. So thank you, Simon, for talking to us, and I'm very delighted to hand over to you now.
Well, good evening, everybody, and thanks, David, for that introduction. David is, in fact, one of the very few people in the world who has actually read my PhD thesis. And not only that, but he then asked me to give this talk. So if you find the talk this evening excruciatingly boring, you know who to blame. Now, I'm slightly fearful of saying this to this particular audience, but the starting point for my talk is that going for a walk in the country for no particular purpose is a pretty odd thing to do. In the past, people walked because they had to, and soldiers, merchants, and pilgrims sometimes walked very long distances in search of victory or profit or salvation. And some of them, no doubt, enjoyed the experience. But for most of history, so far as we can tell, walking was a means to an end, not an end in itself. And the only reason we take this strange activity for granted today is because it is just so popular. In fact, together with eating out, going for a country walk is probably the most popular leisure activity in Britain. Nevertheless, it is a comparatively recent phenomenon. The activity only really became popular about 100 years ago in the late 1920s. And interestingly, it wasn't a gradual process. Almost overnight, hiking became a craze, a fashion attracting thousands of participants and widespread media attention. Now, I think we can all agree that slogging through a peat bog in the driving rain serves no economic purpose, so it must meet some social or cultural need. And the question I set out to answer in my doctoral thesis were, what were the social and cultural origins of the hiking craze, and why did it occur so suddenly in the late 1920s? Now, of course, economics must have played some part, because without adequate nutrition and leisure time, walking for pleasure is simply not an option. But economic factors alone cannot explain why people chose to use increased disposable income, shorter working hours, longer holidays, and greater mobility to walk in the country, rather than some other leisure activity. Back in 1912, the essayist Arthur Sidgwick observed that walking, being above all things human and intimate, is naturally neglected by historians. It cannot be shown to have caused any political convulsions or to have any economic effects. If we want to know whether men walked in the past and in what spirit and with what object they walked, we must turn to literature. But the trouble with literature is that until quite recently, most of it was written by wealthy, well-educated men, whereas I was interested in the motives of ordinary walkers. And as the great historian E.P. Thompson observed, the inarticulate, by definition, leave few records of their thoughts. But one of the great things about the hiking craze from a historian's point of view is that suddenly everybody was talking about hiking. There were newspaper articles, specialist magazines, radio broadcasts, popular songs, even pathé films. And as I looked at this material, it confirmed my hunch that previous histories of the outdoor movement have relied far too much on literary sources written by a small number of highly articulate, middle-aged, middle-class intellectuals and a handful of equally exceptional working-class activists. And by privileging the exceptional over the mundane, historians have ignored the motivations of the vast silent majority of walkers in the 1930s. The other thing to bear in mind about historians is that while they write about the past, they inevitably interpret it in terms of the present. So in history, as in many other things, intellectual fashions come and go, reflecting the social and cultural circumstances that existed when the historian was working. So it's worth reflecting on how historians' interpretations of the outdoor movement have evolved over time. Most historians agree that the first discernible outdoor movement developed in the late 18th century when Wordsworth, Coleridge, and the other Romantic poets transformed long walks through the countryside into a deliberate cultural act. And throughout the 19th and 20th centuries, numerous historians traced the origins of the outdoor movement back to the Romantic movement. Among the first to discuss this link in the mid-19th century were upper middle class intellectuals like Leslie Stephen, who were themselves keen mountaineers and trampers, as well as admirers of the Romantic poets. And Victorian intellectuals like Stephen were prolific writers. So from the mid-19th century right up until the First World War, there was a vast outpouring of books and essays describing walking tours and mountaineering expeditions, often couched in highly romantic language, and often also including scientific observations on the landscapes they passed through. And ever since then, historians have read this literature and linked the growth of the outdoor movement to the Romantic movement and the growth of natural science. Indeed, some historians even concluded that since all the walking literature was written by intellectuals, all the walkers must have been intellectuals. So in 1959, for example, Maurice Marples wrote that before the First World War, walking for pleasure, like climbing, was associated particularly with the intellectual classes. And even in 1987, Helen Walker wrote that in the late 19th century, the individuals who rambled included primarily aesthetes, academics, and members of the legal profession. So here, I think, is a classic example where gaps in the documentary record have distorted our understanding of the past, because we now know, even though it may have been rather poorly recorded, that there must have been a very significant informal walking tradition amongst ordinary working people in the second half of the 19th century. And of course, the reason we know that is because the Commons Preservation Society, founded in 1865, and numerous regional footpath preservation societies, including, of course, our own Peak District and Northern Counties Footpath Preservation Society, sprang up in the second half of the 19th century to protect the rights of ordinary walkers. And many of those societies, including the PNFS, can trace their roots much further back to the early 19th century. We also know that there was a blossoming of natural history societies and other field clubs in the mid-19th century, in some cases with a largely autodidact artisan membership. And many of those clubs went on long scientific rambles through the countryside. And of course, it's possible that the members of those clubs and societies really were all obsessed by geology and botany. But if you look at their minute books and their transactions, they suggest that actually those clubs were highly social in their function. And many of them, for example, held summer picnics to which members of the opposite sex were invited. So there was obviously a lot more going on than just science. And in the closing decades of the 19th century, we do start to see the emergence of pure rambling clubs with little or no pretense of scientific respectability. And many of the members of these clubs were skilled workers, they were clerks, they were shopkeepers, and so on. And many of the clubs were linked to chapels and churches, educational institutions, and as well as some semi-political organizations such as the Clarion Club. In 1893, the Cooperative Holidays Association was established, and they offered extended low-cost rambling holidays to working people as a physically, spiritually, and morally bracing alternative to the vulgar temptations of the seaside resorts and pubs. And around the same time, we also see the development of so-called youth movements like the Boys Brigade and the Boys Scouts, where altruistic or socially controlling adults, according to your taste, deployed outdoor activities as a means of instilling manly virtues, and incidentally also seeking to prevent juvenile delinquency amongst urban youth. And in the 1980s, as historians began to investigate these clubs and associations, the idea began to emerge that there were in fact two outdoor traditions in existence before the First World War. there was an upper middle class, intellectual, literary and romantic tradition, but there was also a quite separate upper working and lower middle class tradition, often with links to nonconformism, that encouraged open-air fellowship and saw walking in the country as a rational recreation that could improve the lives of ordinary working people. But at that time, historians were unable to determine the relative size or importance of these two strands of the outdoor movement, and they also disagreed on which tradition gave rise to the hiking craze in the 1930s. Meanwhile, at roughly the same time, a group of Marxist historians reinterpreted the hiking craze as an ideological movement. And of course, the Kindertrespass in 1932 played a central role in this revisionist history of the movement, notwithstanding the fact that, as David talked about in his talk a few months ago, it actually only involved a few hundred people, most of whom I suspect were probably curious bystanders. And part of the reason for the academic reinterpretation of the movement was the appearance of two popular histories of the campaign for access to open country, both of them written by working class ramblers. The first was Howard Hill's Freedom to Roam, which was published in 1980. And the second was Tom Stevenson's book, The Forbidden Land, which was published posthumously in 1989, but gathered together a lot of articles that he'd written over the previous decades. And Hill started work as a coal miner in Sheffield. He was a member of the Ramblers Association. He was also a member of the Communist Party. And while his book repeated the conventional wisdom that the earliest rambling clubs were gentlemen's clubs, importantly, he distinguished between the motives of what he called the gentlemen's clubs and the people's clubs, which he claimed went into the countryside not to look at nature with the dreaming gaze of poets and writers, but to regain good fellowship amidst the mountain dales, away from the antagonistic relationship of the factory. Tom Stevenson, as I'm sure you all know, was a journalist. He was a member of the Independent Labour Party, and of course, he's probably best known as the father of the Pennine Way. A close friend described him as a bloody-minded visionary, and he was a tireless campaigner for access to open country. And both Hill and Stevenson pursued an overtly political agenda. I mean, both their books have a pronounced regional bias because they are primarily concerned with the struggle of northern working class ramblers like themselves to gain the right to roam over the Pennine moors. So it's not surprising, I think, that some members of the academic community latched onto this idea and reinterpreted the hiking craze as a working class ideological movement, in effect, a protest against social injustice that pitted young socialist urban workers against old conservative landowners in what John Lewison called the battle for the countryside. But interesting, even Lewison, even though Lewison characterized the outdoor movement as a question of mass proletarian liberation, he still believed that the cultural roots of the hiking craze lay in what he called a much distorted and belated romanticism. And that search for neo-romantic explanations for the hiking craze gained further momentum with a new academic movement that set out to explore the meaning of Englishness following the publication of a very influential book by Philip Coles and Robert Dodds in 1986. And this interpretation links the growth of the outdoor movement to disillusionment with modern civilization and the anti-industrialism of Victorian intellectuals like John Ruskin and William Morris. And it suggested that a sort of bucolic or Arcadian conception of the English countryside before the Industrial Revolution gradually permeated the population as a whole by a process of, I suppose you'd say, cultural trickle-down, and becoming pervasive by 1914. And under this interpretation, when people go for a walk in the country, they are either consciously or unconsciously participating in a nostalgic recreation of their rural roots and communities. And that's pretty much where things stood until 1997, when Harvey Taylor hit back against the idea of neo-romanticism and reasserted the importance of ideology and activism. And Taylor argued that the outdoor movement was rooted in open-air fellowship and the rights of free-born Englishmen, or the Scottish Stravaging tradition of roaming at will, rather than atavistic romanticism. And he defined the core activity of what he described as the substantive British outdoor movement as campaigning for access to open country. Now, the trouble with Taylor's analysis is that because he chose to conflate the campaign for access with the outdoor movement as a whole, he inevitably had to locate the earliest roots and much of the subsequent development of the movement in the industrial areas of Lancashire and Yorkshire, because that's where the highest profile access protests took place during the 1930s. And as a result, he completely ignored the rest of the country. And so he failed to recognize that the hiking craze was a nationwide phenomenon, completely unrelated in most regions to the campaign for access to moorlands and mountains. And in fact, the data for membership of rambling clubs and of the YHA in the 1930s suggests that there were far more walkers, particularly young walkers, in London and the southeast than there were in Lancashire and Yorkshire. So to summarize, when I was writing my thesis, there were really two schools of thought about the social and cultural origins of the hiking craze. Some historians argued that it was a continuation of a 19th century upper middle class intellectual romantic walking tradition. Others argued that it was a continuation of a pre-war upper working lower middle class tradition founded upon hard working respectability, self-improvement and collective open air fellowship. And within that school, there were some historians who emphasized the ideological and campaigning aspects and conflating the outdoor movement as a whole with the campaign for access to the Pennine Moors and the Scottish mountains. But when I looked at the evidence, it was clear to me that while both of these pre-First World War traditions remained important in the interwar years, particularly within the preservation movement and the access campaign, in my view, neither of them could actually explain the extraordinary and rapid expansion of leisure that took place in the late 1920s and early 1930s. And perhaps the best way to think about this is to think about the words that ordinary walkers used to describe what they were doing. Because in the late 1920s and 1930s, there were three different verbs which were commonly used to describe going for a walk in the country: tramping, rambling, and hiking. And obviously these three verbs are synonyms. I mean, they all describe essentially the same activity. But in the 1930s, the corresponding nouns of tramper, rambler, and hiker became freighted with assumptions about the age, the class, the respectability, and the motives of the walker. And I think the social and cultural distinctions between trampers, ramblers, and hikers are really the key to understanding the origins of the hiking craze. So I'm going to go through each of those three categories of walker. And here we see a group of trampers. In the 1920s, tramping was still the preferred term used by upper middle class walkers, very much following the tradition of Leslie Stephen's Sunday Tramps, which is one of the earliest upper middle class intellectual walking clubs founded in 1879. And I think when you look at this photograph, you should ask yourself, does this look like the sort of social milieu that would have attracted thousands of working class and lower middle class urban teenagers of both sexes to the outdoors? And I would suggest that both the teenagers and these Scottish gentlemen in their beautifully tailored tweeds would have been horrified at the idea. Stephen Graham gives a pretty good idea of the social attitudes of trampers in his 1927 book, The Gentle Art of Tramping. It is undoubtedly a delicious moment when Miles the gardener, seeing you coming in tramping rig, omits to touch his hat as you pass. It is no small part of the role of the gentle art of tramping to be simple and the humble role, and not to crave respect, honor, and decency. And this sort of espousal of tramping as a classless activity has a long tradition, going back to Wordsworth and his poetic encounters with beggars and vagrants. And I think one of the more ironic aspects of the decline of the upper middle class tramping tradition is that the name began to die out in the 1930s because the popular press started to use the word tramp to describe unemployed men and women searching for work during the Depression. In contrast, the word rambler was adopted by respectable, mainly upper working or lower middle class walkers. But I think the ideological and demographic connotations of the term evolved over time. So before the First World War, most self-designated ramblers appear to have been radical and relatively young. But as the 20th century progressed, the popular image of rambling became increasingly conservative and elderly. And partly this simply reflected the natural aging of the membership of, and particularly the leadership of established clubs. And I think you can see some of that from this photograph of the leadership of the National Council of Ramblers Federations in 1934. I think also that it reflected a very unnatural generation gap that was created by the war, because organized rambling virtually ceased between 1914 and 1919. And when the pre-war rambling clubs restarted activities after quite a prolonged post-war lull, the existing membership were considerably older than the new generation of walkers that emerged in the mid-1920s and 1930s. And many of the traditional clubs became old and cliquey, and they struggled to attract younger members. And part of the reason for this was that the leaders of many formal rambling clubs and associations in the interwar years were Victorians, and they continued to uphold Victorian notions of rational recreation. So they encouraged their members to become informed citizens with a knowledge of local history and natural science. And they defined themselves in part in opposition to day trippers and charabanc parties and motorists and latterly hikers, who they regarded as uninformed and frivolous, noisy, indifferent to beauty, and drawn to pleasure. Now, the origins of the word hiking are a bit of a mystery. It was certainly in use in Scotland in the 19th century, and it was introduced or possibly reintroduced to England via America by the popular press in the late 1920s. And during the early 1930s, the word hiking became almost synonymous with the extraordinary expansion about the outdoor movement, with journalists often using inverted commas to emphasize the novelty of the word, and by application, the novelty of the activity. And the defining characteristic of self-styled hikers was that they were overwhelmingly drawn from the post-war generation. They were born after 1901, so they were too young to fight. And therefore, they were forever divided from their immediate elders by that defining experience of having fought in the trenches. And among older pre-war ramblers, there was a strong prejudice against hikers, which was partly founded upon age, but also upon class and gender, because many pre-war rambling clubs were exclusively male, whereas hiking parties were frequently mixed. And not infrequently exclusively female. But perhaps the biggest complaint that hikers failed to respect the countryside, and worse still, they failed to respect their elders. So while trampers and ramblers conceived of their activity as being physically, intellectually, spiritually, and morally improving, during the 1930s, hikers became associated with noise, litter, rowdy behavior, and immorality. And it's clear from contemporary accounts that some elderly rural residents, and certainly many middle-aged ramblers, felt genuinely intimidated by the completely unfamiliar sight of hordes of young urban youths, like these that we can see in this photograph, marauding through the countryside. So the middle-aged leaders of the Manchester Ramblers Federation were particularly incensed at the attention given to young hikers in the popular press. And this is a quote from the Manchester and District Ramblers Federation Handbook, 1932. So 1931 has been described as the hiker's year, and it deserves everything connoted with that detestable word. We've been surfeited ad nauseum in the popular press with pictures of hikers displaying their amateurishness, 7 of the tribe looking at one map fully spread, hanging in ape-like festoons on apparently precipitous crags, moaning the latest banality. Happy hikers, open-air girls, carefree girls, etc. Never has the human knee had such an audience. The RF has cursed the word, and this is the only paragraph in this handbook where it is allowed to exist. I think it's worth noting the particular criticism there directed at young female hikers. The Times had similar views, contrasting hikers, a mob of young men and women, hapless, raucous, yellow jerseyed, with the genuine rambler who goes about in 2s or 3s and not in hordes. Cyril Joad, who was a popular philosopher and radio personality, described hordes of hikers cackling insanely in the woods or singing raucous songs as they walk arm in arm at midnight down the quiet village street. And even the editor of the popular magazine Hiker and Camper was forced to concede in 1932 that the word hiker had become synonymous with hooliganism. So what on earth was going on here? Well, when J.B. Priestley wrote his famous book about post-war England in 1934, he described a country of arterial and bypass roads, of filling stations and factories that looked like exhibition buildings, of giant cinemas and dance halls and cafes, bungalows with tiny garages, cocktail bars, Woolworths, motor coaches, wireless, hiking, and factory girls looking like actresses. And I think what Priestley was describing was the development of the modern consumer society. And hiking was very much part of this new post-war England. Hiking wasn't a neo-romantic quest for some imaginary, bucolic, Arcadian rural past. It was emphatically modern, and it was emphatically progressive. And in the 1930s, the word progressive was used almost indiscriminately to describe any rejection of Victorian traditions, values, and social mores. So fresh air, exercise, vegetarianism, rational clothing such as shorts and open-necked Airtex shirts, water bathing, sunbathing, nudism, and sex were all progressive. And so was hiking, whereas romanticism, on the other hand, was emphatically not progressive. Like all the other things listed by Priestley, hiking really was a manifestation of increasing wealth, leisure, and consumer choice. But it was also emblematic of an increasingly assertive and self-confident and empowered younger generation. I mean, I hope you can read this slide. The picture in the middle is a flyer sent out by the advertising department of a magazine called Rucksack in 1932, which was published by the Daily Mail Group. At the top it says, they all want food, drink, clothing, household linen, cooking and other utensils, camping, hiking or holiday gear, medical supplies, health salines, dental preparations, insurance, and all the necessities of modern life. Now, I don't think you can claim that Hiking Craze was a neo-romantic rejection of commercial consumerism, when in fact the magazines were advertising all of those things. But what about Harvey Taylor? Was he right when he asserted that the core activity of the substantive British outdoor movement was campaigning for access to open country? Well, I think the short answer to that question is no. In 1932, the best estimates of the number of unaffiliated hikers ranged from about 500,000 to 3 million. At the same time, the total membership of all the clubs affiliated to the Ramblers federations was about 40,000. And within the Ramblers, it was really only the leadership of the Manchester and Sheffield federations, representing about 10,000 walkers between them, who were actively involved in the Access campaign. The highest attendance at the annual Winnets rallies, which was in 1932, was said to be about 10,000. But actually, if you look at the photographs, it looks a lot less. And perhaps 400 people took part in the infamous Kindertrespass. And I think in both cases, it's safe to say that a high proportion of the walkers, both at the Winnets Pass rallies and on the Kenda trespass were really there out of curiosity rather than out of any deep commitment to the cause. Meanwhile, you had hundreds of thousands, possibly millions, of young hikers in the 1930s who were not affiliated to any clubs or associations and took no part whatsoever in collaborative campaigning activities. I mean, instead, they went into the country with informal groups of friends with no rules, no regulations, and importantly, no adults. So I'm sorry, this is rather a busy slide, but I think this is important because it is from a social survey of Sheffield in 1934. And I think this, more than any other document that I read, captures the mood of the hiking craze. But it's worth observing that the author studiously avoided the slang word hiking. He used rambling and tramping, but not hiking, because this was an official document where a slang word would have been inappropriate. So rambling is a very serious business for large numbers of Sheffield boys and girls. It is usually undertaken on Sundays when great crowds of young people go out by tram, bus, or the early morning trains to starting points for day-long tramps in the Peak District. Whilst there are a number of rambling clubs in Sheffield, rambling is essentially unorganized. Groups of boys and girls come together on their own initiative and wander and halt as they will. The magnificent country, quickly reached by excellent transport facilities at very low fares, is a splendid stimulus to the spirit of adventure and youth, and provides an opportunity for boys and girls to meet and enjoy themselves in the open air. The most striking fact about the way boys, and to a lesser extent girls, use their leisure is that it is usually the expression of individual choice, often involving the repudiation of all forms of adult authority, whether expressed in the will or advice of parents, the direction of teachers, the leadership of officers and juvenile organizations, or in the social discipline of institutionalized recreation. That, I think, is about as good a definition as you can get of the hiking craze. At a time when most young people worked 6 days a week, when Sabbatarian laws obliged cinemas and dance halls to close on Sundays, when many houses were small and overcrowded and urban streets were increasingly choked with motor traffic, and when urban parks were still very formal places where middle-aged couples strolled in their Sunday best, the countryside provided a social space where youths of both sexes could interact beyond the supervision of adult authority figures. So I would argue that the hiking craze wasn't a continuation of the pre-war intellectual neo-romantic tradition, nor was it primarily concerned with rational recreational campaigning for access to open country. It was, in fact, an early manifestation of the emergence of popular youth culture, and it was mediated by newspapers, radio, magazines, films, and songs. Sociologists define a youth movement as a group or groups of young people who self-consciously belong to one birth cohort or generation, and who respond to a particular set of social and cultural conditions by rejecting all or some of the practices and values of their elders. Members of youth movements form themselves into a recognizable social group by adopting a common code of behavior or dress that is unconventional or rebellious. And this formative act binds the individuals together, becoming the basis for continuing practice. And I would suggest that long before the Teddy Boys and the Mods, who were the first widely acknowledged examples of popular youth movements in the 1950s, hikers in the 1930s had their own distinctive modes of behavior, including mass singing on Sunday excursion trains, and their own uniform consisting of shorts and brightly colored tops or berets that deliberately invited ridicule from outsiders. So it begs the question, why have historians failed to recognize the hiking craze as a youth movement? And I think the answer is because past studies have just simply given undue weight to the literary record left by middle-aged, middle-class intellectuals and the leaders of organized youth groups, holiday associations, and Ramblers federations, nearly all of whom in the 1930s were middle-aged or elderly men steeped in the pre-war Victorian traditions, plus a few equally exceptional working class access campaigners like Tom Stevenson. And by doing so, I think they ignored the vastly greater numbers of young, inarticulate, unaffiliated hikers who entered the country in search of fun, companionship, and freedom. And to finish, let's just take another look at the painting that I showed at the start of this talk. Because what we have here are 3 young women going for a walk in the country, apparently without male companions. They all have fashionable bobbed hair, and they're wearing shorts and brightly colored berets. They have brown, muscular legs from outdoor exercise, and they're consulting a map, which is traditionally a male domain. And they've also bought themselves all the latest camping gadgets, which are strapped to their brand new Bergen rucksacks. So this quiet rural scene actually represents a youthful rebellion against a whole series of Victorian social norms and conventions. And I think that's why Tucker painted it. So in conclusion, I think as members of the Peak and Northern Footpath Society, I think we should feel very proud that our society continues to represent one of the 2 great pre-First World War traditions within the British outdoor movement. But perhaps we should also consider how we can avoid the fate of so many other traditional rambling clubs and outdoor associations by making ourselves even more attractive to younger members from diverse backgrounds. Thank you very much.